On the morning of May 4th, 1943, Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein brought U-156 to the surface in the South Atlantic for the last time. The previous 18 months had made him one of the most effective submarine commanders in the history of naval warfare. He had sunk or damaged 47 Allied vessels, tankers, freighters, troop transports, across more than 200,000 tons of Allied shipping. He had operated in waters ranging from the American East Coast to the Caribbean to the Gulf of Mexico to the waters off West Africa, striking at the arteries of Allied supply with a precision and audacity that had made his name known in both the German Naval High Command and the Allied Convoy Command centers that were tracking his every transmission. He had also, in September 1942, done something that no submarine commander before or since had done in quite the same way. After sinking the British troopship Laconia, with 2,732 Peopli aboard, including 1,800 Italian prisoners of war who were allies of Germany, he had surfaced and spent the next 3 days conducting one of the most extensive open-ocean rescue operations in the history of submarine warfare, flying Red Cross flags, requesting Allied assistance, and pulling approximately 400 survivors from the water while enemy aircraft circled overhead. The response from American aircraft had been to bomb his submarine while it was conducting the rescue, forcing him to submerge and abandon survivors in the water. The response from Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had been the Laconia order, prohibiting all further rescue of enemy survivors. The response from Hartenstein himself had been a kind of quiet reappraisal that his crew noticed, but that he did not discuss. He was captured in May 1943, when his boat was caught on the surface by Allied aircraft and depth charges during the catastrophe now known as Black May, the month in which the Battle of the Atlantic definitively turned against Germany, when U-boats were lost at a rate that even Dönitz's iron optimism could not present as sustainable. Of the 41 U-boats that sailed in May 1943, 41 were accounted for. The numbers were not in Germany's favor. In a prisoner processing facility in Norfolk, Virginia, 6 weeks after his capture, Hartenstein made a request that his American interrogators found unusual enough to note in their formal report. He asked to visit an American shipyard. The interrogators, after consultation with their superiors, said yes. What happened when Werner Hartenstein stood in the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company and watched American workers laying keels at rates his professional experience could not immediately process? That is the story this video is about. Not simply the story of one submarine captain's personal reckoning, but the story of what the Battle of the Atlantic was actually about, and why it was lost by the side that had, for a specific and terrible period, appeared to be winning it. The Battle of the Atlantic was, in Winston Churchill's estimation, the one campaign that genuinely frightened him throughout the entire war. Not the Battle of Britain, whose outcome was resolved within weeks. Not Alamein, whose strategic importance was great but whose geographic scope was bounded. Not even the prospect of a German atomic weapon, which Churchill's scientific advisors told him was years away from practical realization. The Atlantic was different because it was structural. Britain was an island. Everything Britain needed to survive, food, oil, raw materials, American soldiers, American weapons, crossed the Atlantic. If German submarines could close that supply route, Britain could not continue the war regardless of what happened on any other front. If they could not close it, everything Germany achieved on land was ultimately irrelevant, because the materials for its destruction would keep arriving on the western shore of Europe regardless of what happened in the east. Dönitz understood this with more clarity than almost any other German strategic thinker, and he had spent the years before the war developing the doctrine and the operational concepts for a submarine campaign that could, in his calculation, close the Atlantic route before American industrial production could generate the countermeasures that would defeat it. The calculation was not wrong in its analysis of the vulnerability. It was wrong catastrophically, finally wrong in its assessment of the speed at which American industrial production could generate countermeasures. The mathematics of the campaign, as Dönitz presented them to the German Naval High Command and ultimately to Hitler, was straightforward. Britain imported approximately 47 million tons of material per year before the war. To force Britain out of the war through economic strangulation, Germany needed to sink Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. In 1941, the Allied shipyards were producing approximately 1.1 million tons of new shipping per month. German submarines needed to sink more than that to produce the net reduction that would strangle Britain. In the happy time, the period from mid-1940 through early 1942, when American anti-submarine warfare was in its infancy and the convoy system had not yet fully developed, German submarines were achieving sinking rates that appeared on the monthly charts Dönitz reviewed each morning to support the mathematics. Individual commanders were achieving results that became legends within the U-boat arm. Gunther Preen sank Sank ships. Otto Kretschmer sank 44 UAT-7. Hartenstein himself was accumulating the tally that would reach 47 by the time he was captured. The tonnage was real. The ships were at the bottom of the ocean. The crews were dead. What Dönitz's mathematics did not adequately account for was the denominator, the rate at which American industry could produce new shipping to replace what his submarines were destroying. And the reason they did not adequately account for it was the same reason that almost every German strategic assessment of American industrial capacity underestimated it. They were measuring American production by what American industry had been doing before the war. And what American industry had been doing before the war was producing consumer goods for peacetime demand, not ships for a wartime emergency. The conversion between those two activities was not incremental. It was transformative, and it happened with a speed that no German planning assumption had modeled correctly. The Liberty ship program, which would become the industrial answer to the U-boat campaign, was born from British order placed with American yards in 1944-60. Ocean-going cargo vessels of a design so simple that its critics called it ugly and its supporters called it adequate. The design was based on a British tramp steamer with manual riveting replaced by welding, allowing the hull sections to be prefabricated in separate locations and assembled at the shipway rather than built entirely on the stocks. Henry Kaiser, an industrialist who had built Hoover Dam and the Bay Bridge and had never built a ship in his professional life, looked at the Liberty ship design and saw something that other shipbuilders had not seen on automobile. Not literally, the Liberty ship was 441 feet long and displaced 14,100 tons. But structurally, in the logic of its construction, it was organized around the same principles that had made American automobile production the most efficient in the world: standardized components, prefabricated sub-assemblies, a moving production process in which work came to the workers rather than workers moving to the work, and the elimination of every manufacturing step that did not directly contribute to getting the finished product into the water. Kaiser's shipyards at Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon did not employ shipbuilders in the traditional sense. They employed welders who had learned their trade in the automobile industry, steelworkers who had worked in structural fabrication, and laborers of every background who could be trained to perform specific standardized operations in the sequence the assembly process required. The skills required were not artisanal. They were industrial, the skills of mass production applied to a product that the shipbuilding industry had always treated as artisanal. The results were measured in days. The first Liberty ships took approximately 3 years to build. By 1943, Kaiser's yards had reduced average construction time to 42 days. The record, set in November 1942 as a deliberate demonstration of what was possible under emergency conditions, was 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launching for the SS Robert E. Peary. The demonstration was partly theatrical. The ship required additional outfitting time before it was operational, but the hull that German submarines would have to put a torpedo into had been assembled in less than 5 days from prefabricated components that had been manufactured separately and brought to the shipway-like parts, arriving at an automobile assembly station. The production numbers that followed were the numbers that won the Battle of the Atlantic before the anti-submarine warfare improvements that are more typically cited as its cause. In 1942, American yards launched 5.4 million tons of new shipping. In 1943, they launched 12.4 million tons. In 1944, they launched 18.6 million tons. Dönitz's submarines, at their peak performance in late 1942, were sinking approximately 700,000 tons per month. American yards, in 1943, were launching more than 1 million tons per month. The mathematics that had seemed to support the U-boat campaign in 1941 had reversed themselves entirely by mid-1943, and they had reversed themselves not primarily because of improved convoy escorts or better depth charges or superior radar, though all of these contributed, but because American industry had produced new shipping faster than any German planning assumption had considered possible. Werner Hartenstein had been fighting this arithmetic for 2 years, without being able to see it clearly from the inside of a submarine. In the U-boat arm, success was measured in tonnage sunk and confirmed by the cheers that greeted successful commanders returning to their bases in the French Atlantic ports. The ships that were being built in American yards to replace the ships Hartenstein was sinking were invisible from a submarine's periscope. The production rates at Newport News and Richmond and Portland were numbers that existed in Allied planning documents and American industrial reports, not in the operational picture that German submarine commanders were given. His interrogators at Norfolk were professional men who understood the value of what they were doing, which was not extracting military intelligence from a captured officer. That value was limited, but something more subtle and more important, understanding how the German submarine command's picture of the war compared to reality, and what the gap between those two pictures suggested about German strategic decision-making. Hartenstein, in the weeks of his interrogation, proved unusually willing to engage with the gap. He was not a fanatical National Socialist. He was a professional naval officer who had served his country with exceptional competence, who had tried to do something genuinely decent in the middle of a brutal campaign when he had rescued the Laconia survivors, and who had had that decency answered with American bombs while he was flying a Red Cross flag. The interrogation records suggest a man who had been thinking, in the months between the Laconia and his capture, about what the war was actually about and how it was actually going. The request to visit the shipyard was, in this context, not the casual curiosity of a tourist. It was the professional curiosity of a man who had been fighting a campaign against a supply line and who wanted, now that the campaign was effectively over for him personally, to understand the other side of what he had been fighting. His American escort drove him through the Newport News yard on a morning in July 1943. The escort's notes, preserved in the interrogation archive, describe what Hartenstein saw and what he said. He walked past hull sections that had been prefabricated in different parts of the yard and were being assembled at the shipway as if the ship were a structure being erected from components rather than built from the keel up in the traditional sequence. He watched welding teams working simultaneously on multiple sections. He stood at the end of a completed hull and saw another hull in an earlier stage of assembly in the next berth, and another beyond that, and another beyond that, stretching down the waterfront in a continuous procession that represented not individual ships, but a production line whose output, he calculated quietly, was adding to Allied shipping tonnage faster than his entire patrol career had subtracted from it. He said, according to the escort's notes, nothing for a long time after the tour. Then he said something in German that the escort translated as, I understand now why we could not win this." The escort asked him to clarify. Hartenstein said that he had understood, intellectually, that American industrial production was larger than German production. He had known the numbers. But knowing the numbers and seeing the ships being assembled at this rate were different forms of understanding. The numbers were abstract. The ships were concrete. And the concrete understanding was that for every ship he had sent to the bottom in 2 years of exceptional performance, this single yard was replacing it in days. The story of what Hartenstein saw and said at Newport News is, in one sense, a human story about a professional soldier coming to terms with the reality of the campaign he had been part of. In another sense, it is the most precise illustration available of why the Battle of the Atlantic ended the way it did. Not with a dramatic naval engagement. Not with a technological breakthrough that suddenly solved the submarine problem. But with the grinding arithmetic of production rates meeting sinking rates and production rates winning. The anti-submarine improvements that Black May is typically attributed to improved radar. Better trained convoy escorts, long-range aircraft that could close the mid-Atlantic gap, were real and important. But they were improvements that accelerated a trend that the production numbers had already established. By the time the improved escorts were sinking U-boats at the rate that made continued operations unsustainable in May 1943, the Allied shipyards had already ensured that even the previously sustainable sinking rate was no longer producing the net reduction in available shipping that the campaign's mathematics required. Dönitz continued to send submarines into the Atlantic after Black May. He sent them because he had nothing else to offer strategically and because submarines in port were as lost as submarines at sea. The crews who sailed after May 1943 knew their odds. Survivor rates dropped from the already terrible figures of earlier periods to rates that made. U-boat service, effectively a death sentence for young men who had been told they were the elite of the German Navy. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm during the war, approximately 28,000 died, a casualty rate of 70%. The highest of any service branch in any military in the entire conflict. The men who died in the later period of the campaign died to maintain a strategic fiction that the U-boat campaign could still affect the outcome of a war whose maritime logistics had already been decided by production rates that their submarines could not sink fast enough to matter. Werner Hartenstein survived the war in American captivity. He returned to Germany in 1947 and resumed a civilian career. He did not write a memoir. He did not give interviews about the war, his interrogation records, his request to visit the shipyard, and the notes taken by his American escort represent the most direct account available of how one of the most effective submarine commanders of the war processed the reality of what his campaign had been fighting against. He had sunk 47 ships. The yard he visited had built more than that in the time between his capture and his tour. The war he had fought with exceptional skill and occasional decency had been decided, ultimately, by a form of arithmetic that no individual performance, however exceptional, could overcome. He understood this at Newport News. He had said so. And the understanding, La Chiasifria's, was the most honest professional assessment available of why the Battle of the Atlantic ended the way it did. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts from around the world. We would love to hear from you in the comments, whether you have family connections to this history or simply appreciate learning about the past. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive for future generations.